That's the sermon, everybody. Let's go home. It was amazing. I've been on a journey. Each of us is on a journey of the Spirit, an individual quest for meaning, to find our purpose and to live that purpose with courage and integrity. From the outside, we can't fully know each other's struggles of pain and confusion. The hero's journey is thought to be a solitary one, filled with danger and loss, but ending in victory over evil. But the journey is never that simple. And though it can often feel lonely, you are never truly alone. Most of us aren't fighting dragons or vanquishing demons, at least not external ones. To be sure, there are real and physical battles we can and do face: illness, loss, violence, poverty, racism. But some of the most challenging battles we face are the battles within ourselves. Joseph Campbell, an American professor of literature, studied stories and myths from every culture and every age and found a universal and common story: the hero's journey. In his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he describes this familiar literary archetype as the monomyth, told over and over again. The journey includes 3 main parts and 17 subparts found in countless great adventures, including The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars, and The Wizard of Oz, to name just a few. To Campbell, every hero goes through predictable stages of the quest, whatever that quest may be. The hero is called from an ordinary world to a land of adventure, and inevitably they refuse that call. Then the hero meets companions along the way and comes across a supernatural aid of some kind: a ring, a sword, or a cup. She crosses a threshold and enters into a dark and scary place like the belly of a whale. The hero goes through a series of trials, meets a goddess and a temptress, finds atonement with his father, and achieves success before returning home to normalcy with the magical elixir. Campbell understood the hero's journey as a metaphor for the spiritual journey that each of us travels in our quest for meaning and the internal battles we must face along the way. Stories help us understand our lives and our struggles and ourselves. It's comforting to know that we're not alone in our struggles and to find inspiration in heroic characters. Campbell's work has been studied and valued for decades, and for good reason. There's much to be valued in this way of understanding a universal story. And there's also problems with it, too. For one thing, Campbell's view of the hero's journey is an essentially hetero-cis male one. In fact, when Campbell was asked about the heroine's journey by author Maureen Murdoch, his response was, "Women don't have a hero's journey because they are a goal of the journey. They are the prize." Which is, of course, ridiculous. We know this. There are countless stories of female heroes, even though the word hero itself is masculine. Shero has come into cachet in place of heroine, but even that upholds a false gender binary. I looked for a non-gendered word to use in place of hero. My thesaurus search results included Superman, brave man, male protagonist, and leading man. But it also listed champion and star. I like those. I also like seeker, quester, adventurer, or journeyer, though they don't roll off the tongue quite as easily. For me, the more troubling aspect of the hero's journey archetype, aside from it being an exclusively male-centered narrative, is that it tells a decidedly singular story, as if our journeys take place in isolation or follow a predictable pattern where the solitary protagonist meets adversaries, gathers assistance, and ultimately conquers evil. Our journeys are never singular. They are intertwined and interlocking. Individualism leads us to tell our stories as if we are the center and those around us are only supporting characters. A truer tale, and one worthy of the quest, is a collective journey of liberation in which each singular story is part of the whole, and mutual empowerment is the ultimate prize. We are all the center of our own tale, yes. We're all playing the leading role in the movie about our lives. It's unavoidable that we encounter the world from our own perspective. How could we do anything else? But we can do so much more, be so much more when we are in solidarity with one another. And it's important to consider whose stories are silenced and what we're missing when we live exclusively in our own narrative. Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie, in her powerful TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, speaks of how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story. She tells of her experiences growing up holding a single story of the hired houseboy who served their family, thinking his poverty was the only thing that defined him. And she tells about being the object of a false singular story when her college roommate met her and was startled to find that she could speak English and knew how to use a stove. The danger of the single story comes in thinking that a single story is the whole truth. So much is lost when we believe that one aspect of a person defines everything about them. Adichie says, how stories are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. She goes on to say, stories matter, many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. Knowing that we only experience the world and our struggles in it from our own bodies, with our own limitations and strengths, it is our spiritual work, our duty-bound quest, to recognize the intersecting stories of every other journeyer and to amplify the stories of those who have less power. There's a greater, more mutual empowerment in shared narrative. It is good to find commonalities in our stories, and it is also generative to celebrate the variances in our different stories. In much of the world and throughout much of history, only certain and singular stories are told and retold. Certain stories tend to be at the center of the common narrative, the stories of cisgendered, heterosexual male, white, thin, temporarily able-bodied, English-speaking, Western-educated, middle or upper-class voices. So it's important to ask ourselves, what story isn't being told? Whose voices are not being heard? Whose journey is missing from that shared narrative? Trans activist and journalist Leslie Feinberg writes in the book Transgender Warriors about her quest to find transgender icons. She needed to find herself reflected in courageous stories of people defying the oppressive boundaries of the binary gender myth. Feinberg, who identified as an anti-racist, white, working-class, secular, Jewish, transgender, lesbian, female, revolutionary communist, never felt comfortable with the expected gender roles. Feeling a sense of alienation and fear of violence throughout her life prompted Feinberg's quest to discover trans people who have been revered and celebrated in cultures around the world for many centuries. Feinberg documented the hard-to-find but voluminous examples of gender nonconforming people honored in their respective cultures throughout history, including two-spirit native people in many native nations, intersex deities in many African tribes, religious trans people in traditional Asian societies, and individuals like Joan of Arc, who led a peasant army dressed in men's clothing and was later canonized. For Feinberg, it was important to find herself reflected in other trans people, to know that Z was not alone. But the more important discovery may have been that people of all genders have been valued and respected members of many societies. The stories of the generative value of difference, of the value and beauty of gender expansiveness are widespread, and yet they often remain untold and unheard. Again, this is about who holds power. History is written by the victor, and the hero's journey is told by the conqueror. Feinberg describes the evolution of this hierarchical power, drawing a connection between the accumulation of wealth to the development of patriarchy and the creation of a slave class requiring the branding of some people as different and therefore unworthy of a free status. Looking at history this way shows how the creation of distinct classes with distinct rights created an us and a them. It dehumanizes others so they can be marginalized, criminalized, and subjugated. When society deems you other, every day, every act of self-expression in the world is an act of rebellion and bravery. From a marginalized position, telling your story and having it heard is a life-saving and courageous feat. The most courageous journeys are often those of self-discovery and of building connection across the divide of difference, of emerging from oppression to celebrate who you are. Today is the 10th International Transgender Day of Visibility, which celebrates trans people and raises awareness of the discrimination faced by transgender people worldwide. It is a way of lifting up the stories of trans people living fully and courageously. I want to express my gratitude to the Young Adult Con that was here this weekend. They were mostly at the earlier service, and they've gone on to probably get some sleep. But they named their conference Transcontinental in honor of this day, and by doing so, they made me aware of it. I didn't know about this day. It feels important to talk about trans visibility and inclusion after the recent UU World article that caused much pain and has hopefully created a learning opportunity for our movement. The article was written by a cisgender person about the transgender experience, which in and of itself may not seem to be a horrible thing. However, it was written without authentic dialogue or relationship with trans people. In fact, when the absence of trans voices was pointed out, it was ignored. The article was printed as is with offensive words and content, and many people were harmed as a result. In response to the pain caused by the publishing of this article, the Transforming Hearts Collective wrote a piece called Tips for Talking About the UU World article. The Transforming Hearts Collective, which supports UU congregations in becoming radically welcoming spiritual homes for queer and trans people of all races, classes, abilities, sexualities, and ages, includes trans and queer faith leaders Michael Slack, Sir Alex Capitan, Lelena Romero, and Tio Drake. I posted a copy of the article on the Rainbow Alliance bulletin board, and I have extra copies if anybody would like to read it. One of the tips is about centering. It reads in part, centering is a concept that speaks to whose worldview is most affirmed and whose voices are loudest, whose perspective is treated as normal and thus at the center, and whose perspective is treated as different and thus at the margins. In this case, the assumption is that the default reader is a cis person who struggles to understand and interact respectfully with trans people, just like the author. This assumption renders trans people invisible or further pushed to the margins. It's not that cis people can't ever talk or write about trans people, it's about how they do so, and whether they are adding to and uplifting a conversation started by trans people or displacing the voices and agency of trans people, end quote. It is critically important that we center the voices of those who are marginalized in all ways. An essential part of our work to make the world more whole is to pay attention to who is not in the room, whose voices are not being heard, whose experience is not accounted for. We need to move beyond merely welcoming and truly valuing and celebrating the multiple identities of all people. I appreciated C.B. Beale's response to the UU World article as well, in a blog titled Centering the Marginalized, Symphony and Triptych. CB is an educator and consultant focusing on consent and sexuality education and inclusion and equity for all ages and all bodies. CB is also a gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, genderqueer person. They wrote, "When we UUs speak of inclusion, but we only mean that people are welcome among us when their identities do not cause us confusion or discomfort, we are not speaking of inclusion. When we speak of inclusion, but we mean that white people will write about the lives of black people, that cisgender people will write about the lives of transgender people, that heterosexual people will write about the lives of queer people, that able-bodied people will write about the lives and experiences of people who are disabled by our society, we are doing the opposite of inclusion. It is this which causes me the most harm. My faith has once again, with every good intention, centered people who are understood as typical and decentered marginalized people, and I am right over here." End quote. We all have much to learn about how to live into our vision of a truly inclusive and welcoming community. I'm sad that these opportunities to learn happen so often at the expense of marginalized folks. My wish is that we can learn and grow with more care and more love and less harm. Trans Religious Professional UUs Together, or TRUST, issued a 15-page report of the experiences of trans people in our movement. A summary of the report appears, ironically, in the UU World issue right after the aforementioned article. The report includes 5 suggestions of what we can do to make our congregations more safe, more affirming, and spiritually fulfilling for trans people, and I would argue that these suggestions apply to all those who are marginalized, and all of us. The first suggestion is to donate to fund trans UUs healing and survival. There's a rapid response fund to trans UUs in need, particularly trans UUs of color, trans women and trans feminine UU folks, disabled trans UU people, and trans UU youth and elders. This makes sense, right? We know that what we value, we support with our financial resources. It's what Julie was talking about earlier. It's what we're trying to do here. The second suggestion is to be an accomplice for trans UUs, showing up in a variety of ways for trans people. Third, hire trans religious professionals, and the report links to a service directory of religious professionals who are trans and/or people of color. Next, engage in trans education and transformation. As was stated, we held an upswing workshop here last weekend on how to build a gender-inclusive community, and over 20 leaders in the congregation showed up. The Transforming Hearts Collective also has a 6-part online course titled Trans Inclusion in Congregations, and maybe we'll offer that here. Finally, Trust asks us to take action as a congregation to increase trans access, inclusion, and affirmation. This could mean offering our whole lives for all ages, having everyone wear a gender pronoun label on their name tag, and for goodness sake, pay attention to and use the pronouns that people show on their name tags, please. Taking action as a congregation to be more trans-affirming may mean making our bathrooms more gender-inclusive. It can also mean advocating for trans-affirming legislation in Illinois. There's much work to do, and we can only do this work together as a community. Let me repeat, you do not need to, In fact, you can't engage in this endeavor alone. This is relational work. Find the ways you can engage and keep listening, learning, and sharing. Our journeys interweave to form a rich tapestry of experience and shared truth-telling, where each of us plays the navigator, the guide, the obstacle, the questioner, the catalyst for ourselves and for each other. We all cross thresholds, sink into the abyss, transform, atone, and return. Our challenge as justice-seeking people is to recognize the intersecting and equally valid quests of our fellow travelers and to know that our perspective is only one of many. The way is made clearer and the journey more empowering when those who are oppressed and marginalized have a voice and take the lead. May we stay in relationship with one another and commit to doing the hard work of building a more beloved community. May each of us know the freedom of the journey to struggle and shine, to conquer our inner demons and emerge victorious and in solidarity. May we make it so.